The glass of champagne trembled slightly in Marcus Chen's hand as he stood near the marble pillar of the grand ballroom at the Riverside Country Club. The evening had started like any other corporate promotion party, but something felt different tonight. The air buzzed with an energy he couldn't quite place, and the conversations around him seemed more hushed, more secretive than usual. Marcus had been working at Pinnacle Defense Systems for 8 years, climbing the corporate ladder one careful step at a time. As a senior project manager, he had earned respect for his attention to detail and his ability to deliver results under pressure. Tonight was supposed to be his moment of triumph. After months of behind-the-scenes maneuvering and strategic alliances, he was finally being promoted to Vice President of Strategic Operations. The ballroom was filled with familiar faces from the defense contracting world. CEOs, military liaisons, government officials, and high-ranking executives mingled beneath crystal chandeliers that cast dancing shadows across the polished floor. Marcus recognized most of them, having spent years networking at events just like this one. These were the people who controlled billions of dollars in defense contracts, the power brokers who decided which companies would thrive and which would fade into obscurity. Standing beside Marcus was his closest ally and co-conspirator, David Wellington III. David came from old money, the kind that opened doors without knocking. His family had been in defense contracting for 3 generations, and David had inherited not just wealth, but connections that ran deep through the Pentagon and Capitol Hill. Together, Marcus and David had orchestrated what they believed would be the perfect evening. "She should be arriving any moment now," David whispered, adjusting his platinum cufflinks. His voice carried the confidence of someone who had never known failure. "Everything is in place. The contracts are ready for signature, the board members are here, and our little surprise should catch everyone off guard." Marcus nodded, though his stomach churned with nervous energy. Their plan was ambitious, perhaps too ambitious. They had spent months preparing for this evening, carefully orchestrating every detail to ensure their success. The promotion party was just the beginning. By the end of the night, they intended to announce a revolutionary new partnership that would catapult Pinnacle Defense Systems to the top of the industry. The centerpiece of their strategy involved a mysterious new contact that David claimed to have cultivated over the past several months. According to David, this contact was a recently retired military officer who now worked as an independent consultant. She had access to classified information about upcoming defense contracts worth over $2 billion. More importantly, she was willing to share that information in exchange for a substantial consulting fee and a promise of future business. "Are you sure about this person?" Marcus asked quietly, scanning the crowd for any sign of their expected guest. "You've been very secretive about her background. I still don't even know her name." David smiled in that way that had always made Marcus slightly uncomfortable. It was the smile of someone who knew something others didn't, an expression that spoke of privilege and entitlement. "Trust me, Marcus. I've done my homework. She's exactly what we need to take Pinnacle to the next level. Sometimes you have to take calculated risks to achieve extraordinary results." The party swirled around them with practiced elegance. Waiters in crisp white uniforms moved through the crowd carrying silver trays of hors d'oeuvres and champagne flutes. A string quartet played softly in one corner, their music barely audible above the constant hum of conversation. The guest list read like a who's who of the defense industry, with representatives from major corporations, Pentagon officials, and influential members of Congress. Marcus caught sight of his boss, CEO Jonathan Pierce, holding court near the bar. Pierce was a formidable man in his 60s, with silver hair and steely gray eyes that missed nothing. He had built Pinnacle Defense Systems from a small engineering firm into one of the most respected names in military contracting. Tonight, he would officially announce Marcus's promotion, but Marcus and David had bigger plans that would overshadow even that milestone. "Remember," David continued, his voice barely above a whisper, "when I introduce you to her, let me do the talking initially. She's particular about protocol, having spent so much time in the military. But once she sees what we're offering, she'll be ready to move forward with our arrangement." Marcus took another sip of champagne, trying to calm his nerves. The plan they had developed was brilliant in its simplicity. They would use the insider information to position Pinnacle perfectly for the upcoming contract bids. With advanced knowledge of the government's requirements and budget constraints, they could craft proposals that would be virtually guaranteed to win. The profits would be enormous, enough to transform the company and secure Marcus's position as Pierce's eventual successor. The ethical implications of their plan had kept Marcus awake several nights, but David had been persuasive in his arguments. Everyone in the defense industry operated in gray areas, David had argued. The government expected companies to have inside knowledge and connections. They weren't doing anything illegal, just playing the game better than their competitors. A commotion near the entrance caught Marcus's attention. The conversations in that part of the room had suddenly quieted, and people were turning to look toward the doorway. Marcus followed their gaze and saw a woman entering the ballroom. She was tall and elegant, probably in her early 50s, with short auburn hair and bearing that commanded immediate respect. She wore a simple but expensive black dress that emphasized her athletic build and confident posture. What struck Marcus immediately was the way people reacted to her presence. Conversations stopped mid-sentence as heads turned. Several high-ranking officials moved quickly toward her, their faces showing a mixture of surprise and deference that Marcus had rarely seen at these events. Even CEO Pierce, who rarely showed deference to anyone, was making his way across the room with an expression of genuine respect. "Is that her?" Marcus asked, though something about the woman's commanding presence made him doubt David's description of a simple military consultant. David's face had gone pale, and, for the first time since Marcus had known him, David Wellington III looked genuinely uncertain. I'm not sure. She looks familiar, but..." Before David could finish his sentence, Jonathan Pierce appeared at Marcus's shoulder. The CEO's usual composure was replaced by something approaching excitement mixed with concern. "Marcus, David, I need to speak with both of you immediately. We have a situation developing that requires immediate attention." "What kind of situation?" Marcus asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Pierce glanced around to ensure they wouldn't be overheard, then leaned closer. "General Patricia Sullivan just walked into our party. Four-star general, recently retired from heading Strategic Command. She's one of the most respected military leaders of her generation, and she's here tonight. The question is, do either of you know why?" Marcus felt the champagne glass slip slightly in his suddenly sweaty palm. He looked at David, whose face had now gone from pale to ashen. The confident smile had vanished completely, replaced by an expression that Marcus had never seen before, genuine fear. "David," Marcus said carefully, "please tell me that the military consultant you've been talking about isn't." "General Patricia Sullivan," David whispered, his voice barely audible. Dear God, what have we done? The realization hit Marcus like a physical blow. They had been planning to approach one of the most powerful and respected military leaders in recent history with an offer that bordered on bribery. Worse still, they had assumed she would be willing to compromise her integrity for money. The sheer magnitude of their miscalculation began to sink in as Marcus watched General Sullivan move through the crowd with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to command. Pierce was studying both men with sharp eyes that missed nothing. "I take it from your reactions that you gentlemen know something about the general's presence here tonight?" Marcus opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. How could he explain to his boss that they had planned to corrupt a four-star general? How could he admit that their ambitious scheme was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of who they were dealing with? "Sir," David managed to say, his voice shaking slightly, "there may have been a communications error on our part. We were expecting to meet with a military consultant tonight, but we may have gotten our wires crossed about exactly who that person was." Pierce's expression darkened. "What kind of communications error involves a four-star general showing up at my promotion party uninvited? And, more importantly, what exactly were you planning to discuss with this consultant?" The questions hung in the air like a storm cloud. Marcus could see their carefully constructed plan crumbling around them. But, worse than that, he could see his entire career potentially hanging in the balance. If Pierce learned the full extent of what they had been planning, both he and David would likely be fired immediately, and their reputations in the defense industry would be destroyed. Across the room, General Sullivan was engaged in conversation with several Pentagon officials. Even from a distance, Marcus could see the respect and attention she commanded. These were powerful people who controlled billions of dollars in defense spending, and they were hanging on her every word. The idea that he and David had planned to treat her as just another corrupt consultant now seemed not just foolish, but almost insulting. "We need to approach this situation very carefully," Pierce continued, his voice taking on the tone he used during crisis management meetings. "General Sullivan's presence here could be either a tremendous opportunity or a significant problem for Pinnacle. The key is understanding why she's here and what she wants." Marcus watched as the general's eyes swept across the room, taking in every detail with the practiced assessment of someone trained to evaluate complex situations quickly. For a brief moment, her gaze met his, and Marcus felt as if she was looking directly through him, seeing not just his face but somehow understanding his thoughts and intentions. "Should we approach her?" David asked, some of his color beginning to return as he tried to regain his composure. "Not yet," Pierce replied firmly. "First, I want to understand exactly what communications you've had with anyone representing themselves as connected to the general. Every email, every phone call, every meeting. I need to know everything before we take another step." The weight of their situation was becoming clearer by the moment. Marcus realized that their plan hadn't just failed. It had potentially created a crisis that could damage Pinnacle's relationship with the military establishment. Defense contracting was built on trust and relationships that took decades to develop. A single misstep could destroy everything the company had worked to build. As if sensing the tension building around them, General Sullivan began moving in their direction. She walked with purpose, not the casual mingling of a party guest, but the deliberate movement of someone with a specific objective. Several other guests fell into step behind her, creating a small procession that drew the attention of everyone in their path. "She's coming this way," Marcus said quietly, his mouth suddenly dry. Pierce straightened his shoulders and prepared to greet one of the most powerful women in military history. "Remember, gentlemen, whatever communications error brought her here, she is now our honored guest. We treat her with the respect her service and position deserve." As General Sullivan approached, Marcus could see the details that marked her as someone accustomed to command. Her posture was perfect, her movements economical and precise. Her eyes held the sharp intelligence of someone who had managed complex military operations involving thousands of personnel and billions of dollars in equipment. This was not someone who could be manipulated or deceived. "Mr. Pierce," General Sullivan said as she stopped before them, her voice carrying the clear authority of command. "Thank you for hosting such an elegant event this evening. I understand congratulations are in order for Mr. Chin's promotion." Pierce stepped forward with a smile that masked his uncertainty. "General Sullivan, what an unexpected honor to have you join us tonight. Please, allow me to introduce Marcus Chun, our new Vice President of Strategic Operations, and David Wellington from Wellington Strategic Consulting." The general's handshake was firm and brief, her attention focusing intently on each man as they were introduced. When she shook David's hand, Marcus noticed her pause slightly, as if she recognized something about him. "Mr. Wellington," she said, her tone carefully neutral, "I believe we may have some mutual acquaintances in the consulting world." David's face flushed red, but he managed a weak smile. "Quite possibly, General. It's a small community." "Indeed it is," General Sullivan replied, and Marcus detected something in her voice that suggested she knew far more than she was letting on. "Perhaps we could discuss some of those mutual connections later this evening. I find it's always useful to compare notes with fellow professionals." The implied threat in her words was subtle but unmistakable. Marcus felt his stomach drop as he realized that General Sullivan wasn't here by accident or confusion. She knew exactly who they were and what they had been planning. Somehow, their carefully guarded secret had reached the ears of one of the most powerful people in the military establishment. Pierce, sensing the undercurrents of tension but not understanding their source, attempted to lighten the mood. "General, I hope you'll allow us to properly welcome you to our celebration. Perhaps you'd join us for dinner? I'm sure our guests would be honored to hear some of your insights on current military affairs." General Sullivan's smile was polite, but held an edge that made Marcus's blood run cold. "Thank you for the invitation, Mr. Pierce. Actually, I was hoping to have a private conversation with Mr. Chun and Mr. Wellington. There are some business matters we need to discuss that I believe they're expecting." The words hit Marcus like a sledgehammer. She wasn't here by mistake or coincidence. She knew about their plan, their communications, their intentions. Somehow, their supposedly secure arrangements had been discovered, and now they were face to face with the very person they had planned to corrupt. Pierce looked between Marcus and David with growing suspicion. "Business matters? I was under the impression this was a social gathering." "Oh, it certainly is," General Sullivan replied smoothly. "But, as I'm sure Mr. Wellington can tell you, business and social functions often overlap in our industry. Isn't that right, David?" David nodded weakly, trapped between the need to maintain appearances and the growing certainty that their plan had been exposed from the beginning. "Of course, General. Though perhaps we should schedule a more formal meeting to discuss any business matters properly. I think tonight will be perfect," General Sullivan said with finality. After all, Timing is everything in our business, wouldn't you agree? Marcus watched as their evening transformed from a celebration into what was beginning to feel like an interrogation. The general's presence had shifted the entire dynamic of the party, and he could sense other guests beginning to pay attention to their conversation. Word would spread quickly through the defense contracting community if there was any hint of scandal or impropriety. Perhaps we could step into the private dining room, Pierce suggested, clearly sensing that whatever was happening needed to be moved away from the main party. We can continue our conversation more comfortably there. General Sullivan nodded approvingly. An excellent suggestion. Privacy is important when discussing sensitive matters. As they began moving toward the private dining room, Marcus caught David's arm. We need to think very carefully about what we say, he whispered urgently. If she knows what we were planning, we could be facing more than just embarrassment. David's face was pale and drawn. She knows everything, Marcus. I can see it in her eyes. The question is, what does she plan to do with that knowledge? The private dining room was elegant, but smaller than the main ballroom, with rich wood paneling and a conference table that could seat 12 people comfortably. As they settled into chairs around the table, Marcus felt as if he was entering a courtroom rather than continuing a party conversation. General Sullivan took a seat at the head of the table with the natural authority of someone accustomed to leading meetings. Pierce sat to her right, while Marcus and David found themselves positioned directly across from her, feeling very much like defendants awaiting judgment. Now then, General Sullivan began, her voice taking on a more formal tone. I believe we have some important matters to discuss regarding your recent communications with my office. The words confirmed Marcus's worst fears. Their plan hadn't just failed, it had been known from the beginning. They had walked into a trap of their own making, and now they faced the consequences of their ambition and poor judgment. Pierce leaned forward, his expression serious. General, I think there may be some confusion here. Could you clarify what communications you're referring to? General Sullivan opened a small leather portfolio that Marcus hadn't noticed her carrying. From it, she withdrew several printed documents that she placed carefully on the table. Even from across the table, Marcus could see that they appeared to be copies of emails and correspondence. Over the past 2 months, General Sullivan began, my office has received several communications from Wellington Strategic Consulting, allegedly on behalf of Pinnacle Defense Systems. These communications expressed interest in acquiring classified information regarding upcoming defense contracts in exchange for substantial consulting fees. The silence in the room was deafening. Marcus felt as if the floor had dropped out from under him. Not only had their plan been discovered, but it appeared that David's communications had been more explicit and potentially more illegal than Marcus had realized. Pierce's face had gone rigid with controlled anger. I can assure you, General, that Pinnacle Defense Systems has never authorized any such communications. If someone has been using our company name inappropriately, we will take immediate action to address the situation. I'm certain you will, General Sullivan replied calmly. The question is whether these communications represent unauthorized actions by individuals, or whether they reflect a broader pattern of corporate behavior. Marcus realized that the general wasn't just confronting them about their plan. She was investigating Pinnacle Defense Systems as a whole. Their personal scheme had potentially put the entire company at risk, threatening relationships and contracts that represented hundreds of millions of dollars in business. David finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. General, I think there may have been some misunderstandings in my communications. I never intended to suggest anything inappropriate or unethical. General Sullivan's gaze fixed on David with laser-like intensity. Mr. Wellington, I have spent 30 years in military service, including extensive experience in intelligence and counterintelligence operations. I am quite capable of understanding the clear meaning of written communications, regardless of how diplomatically they may be phrased. The implicit threat was clear. General Sullivan wasn't just a distinguished military officer. She had experience in exactly the kind of operations that would have detected their scheme from the beginning. Marcus began to suspect that their entire plan had been monitored and documented from the very first communication. What exactly are you suggesting happened here? Pierce asked, his CEO instincts taking over as he tried to assess the full scope of the crisis. General Sullivan consulted her documents before responding. The communications I received suggested that Pinnacle Defense Systems was interested in establishing a consulting relationship that would provide advanced knowledge of classified contract requirements and budget allocations. In exchange, the company would guarantee significant consulting fees and preferential treatment in future partnership opportunities. Marcus felt sick as he heard their plan described in such stark terms. When presented in the general's matter-of-fact tone, their scheme sounded exactly like what it was, an attempt at corruption and potentially criminal conspiracy. The question, General Sullivan continued, is whether this was an authorized corporate initiative or the unauthorized action of individuals who may have misrepresented their authority to act on behalf of Pinnacle Defense Systems. Pierce turned to look at Marcus and David with an expression that could have cut steel. I think I need a complete explanation from both of you, immediately. Marcus realized that they had reached the moment of truth. Their plan had not just failed. It had created a crisis that threatened to destroy everything they had worked to build. The next few minutes would determine not just their careers, but potentially their freedom and the future of Pinnacle Defense Systems itself. The weight of their miscalculation was becoming clear. They had planned to manipulate a four-star general, one of the most respected military leaders of her generation, and instead had walked into a carefully orchestrated counter-operation that had documented their every move. As Marcus looked at General Sullivan's calm, professional demeanor, he realized that their evening of triumph had become something else entirely, a reckoning that would test not just their ability to salvage their careers, but their capacity to face the consequences of their ambition and poor judgment. The promotion party continued in the ballroom outside, but in the private dining room, the real business of the evening was just beginning. The silence in the private dining room stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. Marcus Chun felt beads of perspiration forming on his forehead despite the cool air conditioning. Across from him, General Patricia Sullivan sat with the patient stillness of a predator watching its prey, her documents spread before her like evidence in a courtroom. Jonathan Pierce's face had transformed from the jovial expression of a party host to the steely determination of a CEO protecting his company. His gray eyes moved between Marcus and David with an intensity that made Marcus wish he could disappear into the rich mahogany paneling of the walls. I'm waiting for an explanation, Pierce said, his voice low and dangerous. And it better be complete and honest, because I can see from the general's documents that she already knows far more than I do about whatever scheme you two have been cooking up. David Wellington III, who had spent his entire life confident in his ability to charm his way out of difficult situations, seemed to have lost his voice entirely. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for his water glass, the platinum cufflinks that had seemed so elegant earlier now appearing almost gaudy in the formal setting. Marcus realized that someone had to speak, and it would have to be him. David was clearly in no condition to explain their situation coherently. Taking a deep breath, Marcus began the most difficult conversation of his professional life. Sir, over the past several months, David and I developed what we believed was a strategic opportunity for Pinnacle. We had identified potential consulting arrangements that we thought could provide competitive advantages in upcoming defense contracts. General Sullivan leaned back slightly in her chair, her expression remaining neutral, but her eyes never leaving Marcus's face. Please continue, Mr. Chun. I'm particularly interested in how you characterize these consulting arrangements. Pierce held up a hand. Before we go any further, I want to understand the scope of what we're dealing with. General Sullivan, are we talking about potential criminal violations, or are we discussing business ethics issues? The general's smile was thin but not unkind. Mr. Pierce, I appreciate your direct approach. The answer to your question depends largely on what these gentlemen were actually planning to do with any classified information they might have obtained, and how they plan to obtain it. Marcus felt his stomach drop another notch. The word classified hung in the air like a sword over their heads. He had convinced himself that they were operating in a gray area of business intelligence, but the general's words made it clear that they had been approaching something far more serious. We never intended to break any laws, Marcus said quickly. We were simply trying to develop better intelligence about market opportunities and contract requirements. General Sullivan consulted one of her documents. Mr. Chun, I have here a communication from Mr. Wellington's firm requesting access to classified budget allocations for the next fiscal year's strategic weapons systems procurement. How exactly do you characterize that request? David finally found his voice, though it came out as a croak. I may have been too specific in my language. I was trying to understand general trends in defense spending, not requesting actual classified information. Too specific? General Sullivan's eyebrows rose slightly. Mr. Wellington, you specifically requested dollar amounts for programs that are classified at the secret level. You offered a consulting fee of $500,000 for this information. How do you characterize that level of specificity as accidental? Pierce's face went white. $500,000 was a significant sum, but, more importantly, it represented a level of financial commitment that suggested serious intent to commit what could be federal crimes. The CEO turned to stare at David with an expression of complete disbelief. David, please tell me you didn't actually offer to pay for classified information. David's aristocratic composure finally cracked completely. Jonathan, you have to understand, this is how business is done in our industry. Everyone has inside sources. Everyone gets advance information somehow. We were just trying to level the playing field. By committing espionage, General Sullivan's voice remained calm, but there was steel beneath the surface. Mr. Wellington, I'm curious about your understanding of federal law regarding the solicitation of classified information by unauthorized personnel. Marcus watched David's face cycle through a range of expressions: fear, anger, desperation, and, finally, something approaching panic. The man who had seemed so confident and connected just hours earlier was rapidly falling apart under the general's methodical questioning. We need to step back and reassess this entire situation, Pierce said, taking control of the conversation with the authority of someone accustomed to managing crises. General Sullivan, I want to be completely transparent with you. As far as I know, Pinnacle Defense Systems never authorized any communications regarding classified information. If these actions were taken without authorization, what are our options for addressing the situation? General Sullivan gathered her documents and aligned them precisely before responding. Mr. Pierce, that's actually why I'm here tonight, rather than federal investigators. The Department of Defense has been monitoring these communications for several weeks. We wanted to understand whether this represented unauthorized individual actions or a broader pattern of corporate misconduct. The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. The Department of Defense had been watching them for weeks. Their entire plan had been under surveillance from the beginning, and they had walked into tonight completely unaware that they were already caught. Monitoring? Marcus managed to ask. How long have you known about our communications? Mr. Chun, any communications involving requests for classified information trigger automatic security reviews. Your first email to my office was flagged within hours of being sent. Since then, every phone call, every email, every meeting you've planned has been documented and analyzed. David's face had gone from pale to gray. Documented and analyzed by whom? General Sullivan's smile was professional, but held no warmth. Let's just say that the intelligence community takes unauthorized solicitation of classified information very seriously, particularly when it involves defense contractors who hold security clearances and access to sensitive facilities. Pierce leaned forward, his CEO instincts fully engaged now. General, what kind of exposure are we looking at here? Are we talking about criminal charges, security clearance revocations, contract suspensions? All of those are possibilities, General Sullivan replied matter-of-factly. The question is whether Pinnacle Defense Systems wants to be part of the solution or part of the problem. Marcus felt a glimmer of hope at the general's words. If she was talking about solutions, perhaps there was a way out of this nightmare that didn't involve federal prison and the complete destruction of their careers. What kind of solution? He asked carefully. General Sullivan opened a different folder and withdrew another set of documents. The Department of Defense is currently investigating several suspected cases of defense contractors attempting to obtain classified information through improper channels. This investigation has been ongoing for over a year, and your communications represent just one piece of a much larger puzzle. She paused to let this information sink in before continuing. What we've discovered is that there appears to be an organized network of consultants and facilitators who specialize in connecting defense contractors with sources of classified information. Mr. Wellington, your communications suggest that you believe you were dealing with such a network. David nodded weakly. I was contacted by someone claiming to represent retired military personnel who worked as consultants. They said they could provide market intelligence that would help companies compete more effectively for contracts. And you believe this was legitimate? General Sullivan asked. I thought it was a gray area, David admitted. Everyone in the defense industry talks about having inside sources and special intelligence. I thought this was just a more organized version of what everyone else was doing. General Sullivan studied David for a long moment before responding. Mr. Wellington, what you were approached by appears to be a criminal organization that specializes in exploiting the security clearances and access of retired military personnel. The person you were communicating with is currently under federal investigation for conspiracy to commit espionage. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Marcus realized that they hadn't just stumbled into an ethical gray area. They had been targeted by what amounted to an organized crime ring that operated within the defense contracting community. Pierce was taking notes on a small pad he had produced from his jacket pocket. General, if David and Marcus were targeted by this organization, does that change their legal exposure? It depends on their level of knowledge and intent, General Sullivan replied. If they genuinely believe they were engaging in legitimate business intelligence gathering, that's different from knowingly soliciting classified information. The key question is what they plan to do with any information they obtained. Marcus saw an opportunity to potentially salvage something from their situation. General, our plan was to use market intelligence to craft better proposals for legitimate contract competitions. We never intended to resell information or compromise national security. But you were willing to pay for classified information to gain competitive advantages over other companies, General Sullivan pointed out. How is that different from any other form of corruption? The question cut to the heart of Marcus's ethical struggles over the past several months. He had wrestled with the implications of their plan, but David's arguments about industry practices had gradually worn down his resistance. You're right, Marcus said quietly. We convinced ourselves that everyone else was doing the same thing, so it was acceptable for us to do it too. We were wrong. General Sullivan's expression softened slightly. Mr. Chun, the defense contracting industry does have significant ethical challenges. Competition for contracts worth billions of dollars creates enormous pressure to find any possible advantage. But there are lines that cannot be crossed without undermining the entire system. Pierce set down his pen and looked directly at General Sullivan. What would it take to resolve this situation in a way that serves everyone's interests? The Department of Defense is primarily interested in dismantling the criminal network that targeted your employees, General Sullivan explained. We're less interested in prosecuting individuals who may have been manipulated by that network, particularly if they're willing to cooperate with our investigation. Marcus felt a surge of hope, but he forced himself to remain cautious. What kind of cooperation? We need detailed information about everyone you communicated with, every meeting you attended, every offer you received. We need to understand how this organization operates, how they identify targets, how they approach potential clients. David looked up for the first time since his confession. If we cooperate, what happens to us? General Sullivan consulted her notes before responding. If you provide complete cooperation and agree to testify if necessary, the Department of Defense would recommend that the Justice Department focus on the organizers rather than the targets. You would likely face administrative penalties rather than criminal charges. Administrative penalties? Pierce asked. Security clearance suspensions, temporary prohibition from classified contract work, possible civil fines. Serious consequences, but not federal prison sentences. Marcus felt as if he could breathe again for the first time since General Sullivan had entered the ballroom. The prospect of losing his security clearance and being banned from classified work was devastating, but it was infinitely better than federal prison and the complete destruction of his life. There's one more thing, General Sullivan continued. This investigation requires absolute secrecy. If word gets out that the Department of Defense is conducting this operation, the criminals we're targeting will disappear, and we'll lose our chance to shut down their network. Pierce nodded grimly. What does that mean for tonight? We have a room full of people out there who saw you arrive and saw us disappear into this room. Tonight, you're hosting a distinguished retired general at your promotion party, General Sullivan said with a slight smile. We had a pleasant conversation about potential legitimate consulting opportunities. Nothing more, nothing less. Marcus realized that General Sullivan had orchestrated this entire encounter with the same precision she had probably brought to military operations. She had used their own plan against them, turning their intended corruption attempt into an opportunity to advance a broader investigation. You planned this whole thing, he said, understanding flooding through him. You knew we would be here tonight. You knew what we were planning. Mr. Chun, when someone offers to pay me $500,000 for classified information, I take it personally. You were planning to corrupt a United States military officer. Did you really think there wouldn't be consequences? The rebuke was delivered calmly, but Marcus felt its impact like a physical blow. They had been so focused on their own ambitions that they had lost sight of what they were actually proposing to do. They had planned to turn a decorated military officer into a traitor for money. I'm sorry, Marcus said, and he meant it. We lost our way. We convinced ourselves that we were just playing the game better than everyone else. But we were really planning something terrible. General Sullivan studied Marcus for a long moment before nodding slightly. Recognizing that is the first step toward redemption, Mr. Chun. The question now is whether you're willing to do the hard work necessary to earn it. Pierce looked around the table at the three people who would determine Pinnacle's future. What happens next? Next, Mr. Chun and Mr. Wellington provide complete written statements about everyone they've been in contact with regarding this matter. They turn over all communications, all documentation, all records of meetings or phone calls. She paused to ensure she had everyone's attention before continuing. Then, they go back to the party and act as if nothing unusual has happened. They continue their normal business activities while cooperating fully with our investigation. And they pray that we can shut down this criminal network before it does any more damage to the defense contracting industry. David finally seemed to be recovering some of his composure. How long will this investigation take? That depends on how much information you can provide and how cooperative the other targets are willing to be. Could be months, could be over a year. Marcus realized that his promotion celebration had become the beginning of the most difficult period of his professional life. Instead of celebrating his rise to vice president, he would be spending the next year as a cooperating witness in a federal investigation. There's one more thing, General Sullivan said, gathering her documents. This experience should serve as a wake-up call for your entire industry. The pressure to win contracts at any cost is corrupting good people and undermining national security. Companies like Pinnacle need to decide whether they want to be part of the solution or part of the problem. Pierce nodded solemnly. General, I can assure you that Pinnacle will be implementing comprehensive ethics training and oversight procedures to ensure that nothing like this ever happens again. I hope so, Mr. Pierce. Your company has a good reputation, and good reputations are much easier to maintain than they are to rebuild. As General Sullivan prepared to leave the private dining room, Marcus realized that their evening had become something completely different from what any of them had expected. Instead of celebrating a successful scheme, they were beginning the long process of trying to redeem themselves from a terrible mistake. General, Marcus said as she reached the door, thank you for giving us a chance to make this right. She turned back to look at him with an expression that was stern but not unkind. Mr. Chun, I've spent 30 years defending this country. Part of that defense involves protecting the integrity of the systems that keep us safe. You threatened that integrity, whether you realized it or not. She paused before adding, but I also believe in redemption for people who are willing to earn it. Don't make me regret giving you that opportunity. As the door closed behind General Sullivan, the three men sat in silence for several minutes, each processing the magnitude of what had just occurred. Finally, Pierce spoke. Gentlemen, we have a party to return to and a company to save. But first, I want to know everything about how we got to this point. Everything. Marcus realized that their real work was just beginning. They had to return to the party and pretend that nothing had happened, while knowing that their lives had been fundamentally changed by their encounter with a four-star general who had turned their own plan against them. The promotion party that had been meant to celebrate Marcus's rise to power had instead become the beginning of his education in humility, ethics, and the true cost of ambition without integrity. As they prepared to return to the ballroom, Marcus understood that the most important lessons of his career were just beginning. The ballroom felt like a different world when Marcus Chin stepped back through the doorway from the private dining room. The crystal chandeliers cast the same warm light, the string quartet continued their elegant melodies, and the guests still mingled with champagne glasses in hand. But everything had fundamentally changed for Marcus. He moved through the crowd with the strange sensation of watching a movie of his former life, seeing everything through new eyes that understood how close he had come to destroying everything he had worked to build. Jonathan Pierce had insisted they spend another hour at the party, maintaining appearances and ensuring that no one suspected the earth-shattering conversation that had just taken place in private. Marcus watched his boss work the room with practiced ease, introducing General Sullivan to key guests and board members as if her presence was the most natural thing in the world. Pierce's ability to compartmentalize and perform under pressure was one of the qualities that made him such an effective CEO, and Marcus found himself grateful for that skill now more than ever. David Wellington had disappeared shortly after returning to the ballroom, claiming he needed some fresh air. Marcus suspected that David was actually calling his family's lawyer, trying to understand the full extent of the legal jeopardy they might be facing. Despite General Sullivan's assurances about cooperation potentially leading to reduced consequences, Marcus knew that David's family had too much to lose to rely solely on prosecutorial discretion. General Sullivan moved through the party with remarkable grace, engaging in conversations about defense policy and international relations, as if she were simply another distinguished guest enjoying an evening out. Marcus marveled at her ability to seamlessly transition from the stern interrogator in the private dining room to the charming retired general holding court with admirers in the ballroom. He began to understand why she had been so successful in military leadership. She possessed the rare ability to adapt her approach to whatever situation she faced. "Marcus, there you are." The voice belonged to Sarah Mitchell, Pinnacle's Director of Strategic Communications. Sarah had been with the company for 12 years and had become one of Marcus's most trusted colleagues. Her timing couldn't have been worse. "I've been looking for you everywhere. I wanted to discuss the announcement timing for your promotion. Several trade publications want exclusive interviews, and I need to coordinate the messaging." Marcus forced himself to smile and engage with Sarah's questions, even though promotion interviews were now the least of his concerns. How could he explain that his promotion might be overshadowed by a federal investigation? How could he discuss his vision for Pinnacle's future when he wasn't even sure he would still have a job in 6 months? "Let's talk about that tomorrow morning," Marcus managed to say. "Tonight is about celebrating with the team and our guests." Sarah nodded, but Marcus could see her studying his face with the practiced eye of someone whose job involved reading people and situations. "Are you feeling all right? You seem a bit off tonight." The question hit closer to home than Sarah could possibly know. Marcus was indeed feeling off, but not in any way he could explain to a colleague. He was feeling the weight of potentially criminal conduct, the shame of having planned to corrupt a decorated military officer, and the fear of what the next few months might bring. "Just a bit overwhelmed by everything," Marcus replied, which was certainly true, if incomplete. "It's been a big night." As Sarah moved on to other guests, Marcus found himself scanning the room for General Sullivan. She was currently engaged in conversation with Congressman Robert Hayes, who chaired the House Armed Services Committee. Even from across the room, Marcus could see the respect and attention the congressman was paying to the general's words. This was a woman who commanded respect at the highest levels of government and military leadership, and Marcus had planned to treat her like a common criminal willing to sell state secrets for money. The magnitude of their miscalculation continued to sink in as Marcus observed the general's interactions throughout the evening. Every conversation reinforced her stature and integrity, making their scheme seem even more foolish and offensive in retrospect. They hadn't just planned to commit a crime. They had planned to insult and corrupt one of the most respected public servants of her generation. "Mr. Chun." The voice belonged to Admiral James Crawford, retired Chief of Naval Operations, and now a board member of Pinnacle Defense Systems. Admiral Crawford had been Marcus's mentor for the past 3 years, providing guidance and insight that had been instrumental in Marcus's rise through the company. "Congratulations on your promotion." "Well deserved." Marcus shook the Admiral's hand, acutely aware of how different this conversation would be if Admiral Crawford knew what had transpired in the private dining room. "Thank you, sir. I'm honored by the confidence the board has shown in me. I've been talking with General Sullivan this evening," Admiral Crawford continued, and Marcus felt his stomach clench. Remarkable woman. Brilliant strategic mind, impeccable integrity. The kind of officer who makes the entire military look good. The words felt like knives. Marcus forced himself to nod and make appropriate responses, all while knowing that he had planned to corrupt exactly the kind of person Admiral Crawford was praising. The conversation became a form of torture, each compliment about General Sullivan's character serving as an indictment of Marcus's own planned actions. "In fact," Admiral Crawford continued, "I was thinking that Pinnacle might benefit from her insights as a consultant. Not on classified matters, of course, but on strategic planning and organizational development. Her experience in managing complex operations could be invaluable." Marcus nearly choked on his champagne. The irony was overwhelming. Admiral Crawford was suggesting exactly the kind of legitimate consulting relationship that Marcus and David should have pursued from the beginning, if they had any interest in actually working with General Sullivan rather than corrupting her. "That's an interesting idea," Marcus managed to say. "Perhaps we could explore that possibility." As Admiral Crawford moved on to other conversations, Marcus realized that he needed to find a quiet space to process everything that was happening. The cognitive dissonance between maintaining his public persona and dealing with his private crisis was becoming overwhelming. He made his way to a small alcove near the back of the ballroom, where he could observe the party while having some space to think. From his vantage point, Marcus watched General Sullivan continue her conversations with various guests. She seemed to genuinely enjoy the interactions, discussing everything from international relations to military history with obvious knowledge and passion. This was a woman who had dedicated her life to public service, who had risen to the highest ranks of military leadership through merit and integrity. The idea that she would compromise her principles for money now seemed not just criminal, but absurd. Having second thoughts about something, the voice startled Marcus from his observations. He turned to see David Wellington approaching, looking considerably more composed than he had an hour earlier. "Where did you go?" Marcus asked quietly. "Called my father's attorney," David replied, confirming Marcus's suspicions. "Wanted to understand our legal exposure if we cooperate fully with the investigation." "And what did he say?" David glanced around to ensure they wouldn't be overheard before responding. "He said that cooperation is our best option, but we need to be very careful about how we handle it. Full disclosure, complete honesty, and absolutely no attempt to minimize or hide anything." Marcus nodded. "Did you tell him about General Sullivan's offer to focus on administrative rather than criminal penalties?" "He said that's promising, but not guaranteed. Federal prosecutors make the final decisions about charges, not the Defense Department. Our best hope is that the DoD recommendation will carry significant weight." The uncertainty was maddening. Marcus had always been someone who liked to plan and control outcomes, but now he found himself completely dependent on the mercy of prosecutors and investigators he had never met. The next several months would be spent living with the constant uncertainty of not knowing whether his cooperation would be sufficient to avoid criminal charges. "There's something else," David continued. "My attorney thinks we may not be the only targets of this investigation. He's heard rumors about a broader federal probe into defense contractor corruption. If that's true, our case might be part of something much larger." Marcus considered this information. If they were part of a larger investigation, it might mean they were viewed as relatively minor players, which could work in their favor. On the other hand, it might mean that federal prosecutors were building a comprehensive case against the entire industry, which could make them eager for high-profile convictions to demonstrate the seriousness of their efforts. "David, can I ask you something?" Marcus said after a moment of reflection. "Of course. How did you first get connected with this consulting network? I mean, what made you think they were legitimate?" David was quiet for a long moment, apparently weighing how much to reveal. Finally, he spoke carefully. "I was approached at a conference about 6 months ago. Someone said they had heard about my consulting work and thought I might be interested in expanding into government intelligence. They knew specific details about my background and my clients. It seemed like a normal networking conversation, but it wasn't. Looking back, I think I was being evaluated. They were probably researching potential targets, looking for people who might be vulnerable to their approach. Someone with my family connections and business ambitions probably fit their profile perfectly." Marcus realized that David had been manipulated just as much as he had been. The criminal network General Sullivan had described was apparently sophisticated in its approach to recruiting targets, using legitimate business networking as cover for criminal solicitation. "Do you think we're the only ones from Pinnacle who were approached?" Marcus asked. David's face went pale. "I hadn't thought about that. What if they approached other employees? What if this goes deeper into the company than just us?" The possibility was terrifying. If other Pinnacle employees had been targeted by the same network, it could mean that the company's entire security clearance and contracting status was at risk. It could also mean that Marcus and David were not isolated bad actors, but part of a broader pattern of corruption within the company. "We need to tell Pierce about this possibility," Marcus said. "If there are other employees involved, he needs to know before the investigators find out on their own." Before David could respond, they were interrupted by the approach of General Sullivan herself. She moved toward them with the same purposeful stride Marcus had observed earlier in the evening, and he felt his pulse quicken as she drew near. "Gentlemen," she said pleasantly, "I hope you're enjoying the rest of the evening." "Yes, ma'am," Marcus replied automatically, falling back on the respectful tone he had been taught to use with senior military officers. "I wanted to let you know that I'll be in touch with both of you early next week to begin the process we discussed. I trust you'll both be prepared to provide complete cooperation." "Absolutely," David said quickly. "Whatever you need." General Sullivan studied both men for a moment before speaking again. "I also wanted to give you some advice, if you're willing to hear it." Marcus nodded eagerly. Any guidance from someone with General Sullivan's experience and insight could be invaluable in navigating the difficult months ahead. "What happened here tonight represents a choice point for both of you," she began. "You can view this as the worst thing that's ever happened to you, or you can view it as an opportunity to fundamentally change the trajectory of your careers and your lives. She paused to let this sink in before continuing. The defense industry has serious ethical challenges. Too many good people convince themselves that compromise and corruption are necessary to succeed. They're wrong, but the pressure is real and the temptations are significant. What would you advise us to do? Marcus asked. First, complete your cooperation with our investigation fully and honestly. Help us shut down the network that targeted you, and help us understand how they operate so we can prevent them from targeting others. And after that, General Sullivan's expression became more thoughtful. After that, you have a chance to become leaders in cleaning up this industry. Use your experience to help other companies avoid the mistakes you made. Become advocates for integrity and ethical behavior in defense contracting. Marcus felt a spark of hope for the first time since entering the private dining room hours earlier. General Sullivan wasn't just offering them a way to avoid criminal charges. She was suggesting a path toward redemption that could ultimately make their careers more meaningful than they had ever been before. You think we could actually do something positive with this experience? David asked. I think people who have faced their own capacity for ethical failure often become the strongest advocates for doing the right thing, General Sullivan replied. But only if they're willing to do the hard work of genuine redemption. As the general moved away to rejoin other conversations, Marcus felt a profound shift in his understanding of their situation. Instead of viewing the evening as a complete disaster, he began to see it as the beginning of a different kind of career, one focused on integrity rather than just success. She's giving us a roadmap, he said to David quietly. I know. The question is whether we're strong enough to follow it. Marcus looked around the ballroom at the guests who continued their conversations, unaware of the drama that had unfolded in the private dining room. Many of these people faced the same pressures and temptations that had led Marcus and David astray. How many of them had made similar compromises? How many were currently involved in ethical gray areas that could eventually lead them to the same crisis Marcus and David now faced? David, I think we need to make a decision right now about who we want to be going forward. What do you mean? Marcus turned to face his former co-conspirator directly. We can spend the next year just trying to minimize our legal exposure and get back to business as usual, or we can use this as an opportunity to actually become better people and better professionals. David was quiet for a long moment, considering Marcus's words. Finally, he nodded slowly. You're right. We've been given a second chance that we probably don't deserve. We shouldn't waste it. As the evening continued around them, Marcus realized that his promotion party had indeed become a celebration, just not the kind he had originally planned. Instead of celebrating their scheme's success, he was celebrating the fact that they had been caught before they could actually commit the crimes they had been planning. Instead of toasting their corruption, he was toasting their opportunity for redemption. The party would end soon, and tomorrow would begin the long process of cooperation, investigation, and hopefully redemption. But for tonight, Marcus allowed himself to feel grateful for the four-star general who had saved them from themselves, even as she had destroyed their original plan. General Sullivan had not just prevented them from committing crimes. She had offered them something far more valuable, a chance to become the kind of people they should have been all along. Whether they proved worthy of that chance would depend on the choices they made in the difficult months ahead. The following Monday morning arrived gray and drizzling, matching Marcus Chen's mood as he sat in his newly appointed corner office at Pinnacle Defense Systems. The executive suite that should have represented the pinnacle of his career success instead felt like a waiting room for judgment. Through his floor-to-ceiling windows, he could see the Potomac River flowing steadily toward the Chesapeake Bay, carrying with it the detritus of the weekend storm. Marcus found himself wondering if his career would follow a similar path to destruction. The weekend had been a blur of sleepless nights and anxious conversations with his wife, Jennifer. He had been forced to tell her everything, watching as her initial excitement about his promotion transformed into horror and, then, fear as she understood the magnitude of what he had nearly done. Jennifer was a lawyer herself, specializing in corporate compliance, which made her reaction even more devastating. She understood the legal implications better than most spouses would have. How could you even consider something like this? She had asked repeatedly, pacing their kitchen while their two young children slept upstairs, blissfully unaware that their father's actions might fundamentally alter their family's future. Marcus had no good answer. In the cold light of retrospection, their plan seemed not just criminal, but inexplicably stupid. How had he convinced himself that approaching a decorated military officer with offers of money for classified information was anything other than an attempt at espionage? How had David's smooth arguments about industry practices overcome Marcus's natural ethical instincts? His computer chimed with an incoming email that made his stomach clench. The sender was listed simply as P. Sullivan, with a subject line that read Schedule Discussion, Urgent. Marcus opened the message with trembling hands. Mr. Chun, please report to the Marriott Crystal Gateway, Conference Room 1247, at 2 p.m. today. Come prepared to provide complete documentation of all communications related to our previous discussion. Bring legal counsel if desired. General P. Sullivan. The message was brief and formal, carrying the unmistakable tone of military efficiency. Marcus immediately forwarded it to David Wellington and Jonathan Pierce, then called his attorney. The conversation with his lawyer had been expensive and sobering. Federal defense attorneys charged premium rates, and the initial retainer alone had required Marcus to liquidate most of his savings account. The fact that they want to meet so quickly is probably good news, his attorney had explained. If they were planning to arrest you, they wouldn't be scheduling voluntary meetings. This sounds like the beginning of the cooperation process, General Sullivan mentioned. By 1:30 p.m., Marcus found himself in the parking lot of the Marriott Crystal Gateway, a nondescript hotel that served as a common meeting location for government contractors and Pentagon personnel. David's BMW was already parked near the entrance, and Marcus could see his former co-conspirator sitting in the driver's seat, apparently steeling himself for what lay ahead. The hotel lobby was busy with the usual mix of business travelers and government contractors, men and women in conservative suits carrying briefcases and speaking in the careful, measured tones of people accustomed to handling sensitive information. Marcus wondered how many of them faced ethical dilemmas similar to his own, and how many had made better choices when confronted with temptation. Conference room 1247 was larger than Marcus had expected, with seating for about 20 people around a polished wooden table. General Sullivan was already present, along with two other individuals Marcus didn't recognize. One was a woman in her 40s wearing a dark suit that practically screamed federal agent, and the other was a man about Marcus's age wearing the kind of expensive but conservative clothing favored by government lawyers. Mr. Chun, Mr. Wellington, General Sullivan said as they entered the room. Thank you for being prompt. Please have a seat. Marcus and David took seats across the table from the three government representatives, with their attorneys flanking them on either side. The formality of the setting made the gravity of their situation impossible to ignore. This wasn't a business meeting or a networking session. This was the beginning of a federal investigation that could determine their futures. Before we begin, General Sullivan continued, I want to introduce my colleagues. Agent Sarah Blackwood is with the Defense Criminal Investigative Service, and Assistant United States Attorney Michael Harrison will be handling any potential prosecutions that arise from this matter. The introduction sent a chill through Marcus. The Defense Criminal Investigative Service was the Pentagon's equivalent of the FBI, responsible for investigating major crimes. If you provide complete cooperation and useful information, we're prepared to recommend significantly reduced penalties or potentially no criminal charges at all. Marcus felt himself beginning to breathe again, but Assistant United States Attorney Harrison quickly tempered any optimism. I want to be clear that cooperation doesn't guarantee immunity, Harrison said. Your ultimate exposure will depend on the quality and completeness of the information you provide, the extent of your criminal intent, and the overall needs of our investigation. David spoke for the first time since entering the room. What specific information do you need from us? General Sullivan consulted a thick file before responding. We need everything. Every email, every phone call, every meeting, every person you spoke with about obtaining classified information or insider intelligence. We need to understand exactly how this criminal network operates and who else might be involved. Agent Blackwood added, we're particularly interested in the individuals who first approached Mr. Wellington. We believe this network has been operating for several years and may have successfully recruited other defense contractors. Marcus realized that their case was part of something much larger than he had initially understood. They weren't just isolated bad actors who had made poor choices. They were victims of what appeared to be an organized criminal conspiracy that had been targeting defense contractors systematically. How many other companies might be involved? Marcus asked. We're not at liberty to discuss the full scope of our investigation, Harrison replied carefully. But I can tell you that your cooperation could be instrumental in preventing other companies and individuals from making the same mistakes you nearly made. The next 2 hours were grueling. Agent Blackwood and Harrison systematically walked through every detail of Marcus and David's communications with the criminal network. They wanted to know how the initial contact was made, what promises were offered, how payments were supposed to be arranged, and what specific information was being sought. David's answers painted a picture of a sophisticated operation that had clearly done extensive research on both men before approaching them. The criminals knew details about David's family background, his business connections, his financial situation, and his personal ambitions. They had tailored their approach specifically to appeal to his desire to expand his consulting business and gain access to higher-level government contracts. They made it seem like a natural evolution of my existing work, David explained. I was already providing strategic consulting to defense contractors. They positioned their services as just a more advanced version of market intelligence gathering. Marcus described how David had gradually introduced the concept to him, framing it as an opportunity to give Pinnacle a decisive competitive advantage in upcoming contract competitions. The criminals had apparently coached David on how to recruit his target, providing specific arguments and justifications designed to overcome ethical objections. They understood that most people have natural resistance to obviously criminal activity, Agent Blackwood explained. So they developed sophisticated techniques for gradually normalizing the concept of paying for classified information. They frame it as industry standard practice, as necessary for competitive survival, as something everyone else is already doing. General Sullivan had remained mostly quiet during the detailed questioning, but now she spoke directly to Marcus. Mr. Chun, I want to understand your thought process. You're an intelligent man with a successful career and a lot to lose. What made you willing to risk everything for what was essentially a criminal scheme? The question forced Marcus to confront the deeper psychological factors that had led him astray. I think I got caught up in the competitive pressure, he said slowly. The defense industry is incredibly competitive, and there's constant pressure to find any edge you can get. When David presented this as a way to level the playing field, it was easy to convince myself that we were just playing the game better than everyone else. But you knew it was wrong, General Sullivan pressed. Marcus nodded reluctantly. Part of me knew it was wrong, but I rationalized it. I told myself that everyone else was probably doing similar things, that we were just being more systematic about it. I convinced myself that the information we were seeking wasn't really that sensitive, that we weren't actually compromising national security. Mr. Chun, the budget information you were seeking to purchase could have provided enormous advantages in contract competitions worth hundreds of millions of dollars. How is that not compromising national security? The question forced Marcus to confront the full implications of what they had been planning. You're right. I was lying to myself about the seriousness of what we were doing. I wanted the competitive advantage so badly that I was willing to ignore the ethical and legal implications. Agent Blackwood made notes throughout these exchanges, documenting not just the factual details of their communications, but the psychological factors that had made them vulnerable to recruitment by the criminal network. Marcus began to understand that their cooperation was helping to build a comprehensive profile of how these criminals operated and how they might be prevented from recruiting future victims. There's one more thing we need to discuss, Harrison said as the formal questioning began to wind down. Going forward, your cooperation will require you to potentially participate in controlled communications with these criminals. If they attempt to contact you again, you'll need to report it immediately and potentially participate in recorded conversations to gather additional evidence. The prospect of continuing contact with the criminals was terrifying. Marcus had hoped that confessing everything would end his involvement, but now he understood that his cooperation might require him to actively participate in the investigation for months or even years. What if they become suspicious? David asked. What if they realize we've been compromised? That's obviously a risk, Agent Blackwood admitted. But these criminals are arrogant, and they believe their techniques are foolproof. They're unlikely to suspect that their targets have confessed unless you give them reason to. General Sullivan gathered her files as the meeting prepared to conclude. Gentlemen, I want you to understand something very important. This investigation represents your opportunity to redeem yourselves, but it also represents a chance to protect other people from making the same mistakes you made. She paused to ensure she had their complete attention. The criminal network that targeted you has probably recruited dozens of other defense contractors over the past several years. Some of them may have actually provided classified information and committed espionage. Your cooperation could be the key to stopping them and preventing future compromises of national security. Marcus felt the weight of this responsibility settling on his shoulders. Instead of simply trying to minimize his own legal exposure, he was being asked to help protect national security and prevent other people from destroying their careers and potentially their lives. "We'll do whatever is necessary," Marcus said, and he meant it. As the meeting concluded and they prepared to leave, Assistant United States Attorney Harrison provided them with specific instructions for the days and weeks ahead. They were to continue their normal business activities while remaining alert for any contact from the criminal network. They were to provide additional documentation as requested, and they were to keep the investigation completely confidential. "Remember," Harrison emphasized, "if word of this investigation gets out prematurely, the criminals will disappear and we'll lose our chance to stop them. Your discretion isn't just important for your own legal protection, it's essential for national security." Walking back to the parking lot, Marcus felt emotionally drained but oddly hopeful. The meeting had confirmed that they faced serious legal jeopardy, but it had also provided a path toward redemption that could ultimately make their experience meaningful rather than just destructive. "Do you think we can actually do this?" David asked as they reached their cars. Marcus considered the question carefully before answering. "I think we have to. We created this mess, and now we have a chance to help fix something bigger than just our own mistakes." As Marcus drove back to Pinnacle's offices, he reflected on how fundamentally his life had changed in just a few days. The promotion that should have been the highlight of his career had become almost irrelevant compared to the larger questions of integrity, redemption, and service that he now faced. His phone buzzed with a text message from Jennifer. "How did it go? Are we going to be okay?" Marcus typed back, "It's going to be difficult, but I think we're going to come out of this stronger than before." He wasn't sure if he believed his own words, but for the first time since General Sullivan had walked into the ballroom on Friday night, Marcus felt like he might actually have a future worth fighting 4.18 months after the promotion party that changed his life. Marcus Chin stood before a packed auditorium at the National Defense University, preparing to deliver a presentation that would have been unimaginable during his darkest moments of the federal investigation. The title on the screen behind him read, "Ethical Leadership in Defense Contracting, Lessons Learned from the Front Lines of Integrity." The audience consisted of senior military officers, defense industry executives, government officials, and ethics professors from universities across the country. Many of these people knew Marcus's story, the dramatic fall from rising corporate star to federal cooperating witness, and his subsequent transformation into one of the industry's most respected voices on ethics and integrity. In the front row sat General Patricia Sullivan, now serving as the Director of Defense Ethics and Compliance, a new position created partly in response to the investigation that had begun with Marcus and David's attempted corruption. Next to her sat Jonathan Pierce, who had not only retained Marcus as vice president despite the scandal, but had promoted him to chief ethics officer, making Pinnacle Defense Systems a leader in corporate integrity within the defense sector. Marcus began his presentation with a confession that still made him uncomfortable, even after telling the story hundreds of times. 18 months ago, I was prepared to commit espionage against the United States. I was planning to pay for classified information to gain competitive advantages for my company. I convinced myself that I was just playing the game better than everyone else. But the truth is that I was planning to betray the country I had spent my entire career trying to serve. The auditorium was completely silent as Marcus continued. He had learned that starting with the blunt truth, no matter how uncomfortable, was the only way to establish the credibility necessary to deliver his message effectively. The investigation that followed his cooperation had been even more extensive and successful than anyone had initially hoped. The criminal network that had targeted Marcus and David turned out to be a sophisticated operation that had successfully recruited over 24 defense contractors across 8 states. The criminals had obtained millions of dollars worth of classified information, compromising dozens of sensitive military programs, and potentially costing taxpayers billions of dollars in inflated contract prices. Marcus's cooperation had been instrumental in dismantling the entire network. His willingness to participate in recorded conversations with the criminals had provided prosecutors with the evidence they needed to secure convictions against all of the network's leaders. More importantly, his detailed analysis of how he had been recruited and manipulated had helped the government develop training programs to help other contractors recognize and resist similar approaches. The criminal network that targeted me understood something that I didn't understand about myself. Marcus continued his presentation. They understood that good people can be gradually corrupted if the corruption is presented properly. They didn't approach me with an obvious criminal proposal. Instead, they gradually normalized the concept of paying for classified information by framing it as industry standard practice. David Wellington had not fared as well during the investigation. Despite his cooperation, prosecutors had determined that his role in recruiting Marcus and potentially other contractors represented a more serious level of criminal involvement. He had ultimately pleaded guilty to conspiracy charges and served 14 months in federal prison, losing his security clearance permanently and effectively ending his career in defense contracting. The difference in their treatment had been partly due to the evidence, but mostly due to their responses after being caught. Marcus had embraced the opportunity for redemption, working tirelessly to help investigators understand the criminal network and developing new approaches to ethics training that were now being implemented across the industry. David had cooperated fully with the investigation, but had shown little interest in the broader implications of their experience or in working to prevent similar problems in the future. After my cooperation with the investigation was complete, Marcus continued, I faced a choice that would determine the rest of my career and my life. I could try to put the whole experience behind me and return to business as usual, or I could use what I had learned to try to make the defense industry more ethical and more secure. The choice had not been easy. There had been significant pressure from colleagues and friends to keep quiet about his experience, to avoid the stigma and controversy that came with public confession of near-criminal conduct. Many people in the defense industry viewed ethics violations as unfortunate, but inevitable, part of the cost of doing business in a highly competitive environment. But General Sullivan had continued to serve as Marcus's mentor throughout the process, helping him understand that his experience could serve a larger purpose if he was willing to embrace it fully. You have a choice, she had told him during one of their regular conversations. You can be someone who almost committed a crime, or you can be someone who learned from a terrible mistake and dedicated his career to preventing others from making similar mistakes. The transformation had been gradual, but profound. Marcus had begun by developing new ethics training programs for Pinnacle's employees, drawing on his personal experience to help others recognize the warning signs of gradual ethical compromise. The programs had been so successful that other companies had requested similar training, leading to Marcus's emergence as a sought-after speaker and consultant on defense industry ethics. The key insight from my experience, Marcus told his audience, is that ethical failures rarely happen suddenly. They happen gradually, through a series of small compromises that individually seem reasonable, but collectively lead to criminal conduct. The criminal network that targeted me understood this, and they designed their recruitment process to exploit it. In the audience, Marcus could see heads nodding as people recognized the truth of his words in their own experiences. The defense industry was indeed full of ethical gray